to introduce Henry Noble to kick off our webinar, and he will introduce the Icon Scaled Agile coaches, Charlene Cuenca and Scott Green, to help tell the Vantiv story. Henry, take it away.
Thank you, Stella. Hi, this is Henry Noble. I'm the program director at Vantiv, in charge of our Agile transformation. And joining me today on this webinar along with Stella is Charlene Cuenca. She was one of our initial Agile coaches that we had from Icon that helped us with our transformation throughout the journey, along with Scott Green, who was another one of our Agile coaches from Icon. The two of them definitely set a high bar as far as the Agile coaches go, and they were, incredibly valuable to our transformation. And if it wasn't for them, we probably wouldn't have gotten as far as we have. So you'll hear from both of them throughout this webinar. So let's start out with Vantiv from an overview perspective. So Vantiv, we're the leading provider of payment processing services and technology, and we do that for merchants and financial institutions of all sizes. We have around 3,000 employees. We serve 1,400 financial institutions or banks, and then we are working with 800,000 merchant locations. So we went ahead and wanted to understand where we are going and why we are going to Agile. So in the payment industry, it's a fast-paced industry, and there's new technologies that disrupt this industry all the time. Some of the latest ones are around Bitcoin and stuff like that. So in order for us to really compete across the payment industry, we felt that we had to, become more agile. Now, we read everything that Agile promised, and it sounded like that's what we wanted. So we felt like that was the route to go. But as we talk through this, we'll talk about how we realized many of those benefits along the way. Vantiv, we've grown through acquisition throughout the years, and in order to become one unified Vantiv, we needed to come up and have a common operating model across the entire organization. Therefore, we knew we wanted to go Agile, and in order to support Agile at an enterprise level, we knew we had to scale Agile. And that's why, in looking through the various potential options, we chose the Scaled Agile framework. SAFE, as many people would know that by. So our journey started probably in 2013. At the time, we had an executive that was pushing for us to move towards Agile. We were able to get the funding, so we focused on bringing in a bunch of tools and processes. So we focused on tools and processes in 2013, and that took us into 2014. And during that time, what we were able to do was we realized that tools and process alone was not going to make for a successful transformation. We realized that we had to focus at the people level. So as you see here, some of the past attempts, the challenges that we faced were, if you start bottom up, was we had internal coaching. During our transformation in 2013, 2014, we had highly qualified Agile coaches here at Vantiv. Unfortunately, at the time, they were Vantiv employees, and since we really didn't have executive buy-in across the enterprise, there were times where we had to make concessions with regards to Agile. So that was one of the things leading into our latest transformation, that we had decided that we needed to go get outside Agile coaches because they were able to make us stay true to Agile. Also, given that we were transforming multiple times, there was a case of change fatigue here at Vantiv. Through 2013 to 2014, the morale around here was probably at an all-time low. And then when we launched the new transformation starting in 2015, there was a significant amount of skepticism around that. We had tried Agile, we tried other things, and people were really starting to question whether or not this was the direction to go. So, there were probably three things that led us to this, where we're going to talk about next. And first of all, there were three items that took place here at Vantiv that really spawned off a successful transformation. Number one, at an enterprise level, our executive team had identified that truly to be successful, we needed to go ahead and implement a new operating model across the enterprise. So with that being the highest priority across the enterprise, from an Agile transformation perspective, we were able to work under the guise of the True North organizational change effort and really have executive level support for changing how we do work here at Vantiv. Secondly, we also realized that we needed to get away from being order takers and start to work more towards a product development model. And then thirdly, we got consultants in here both at an Agile transformation level as well as Agile team level coaches. Those three things together were really the three key points of the transformation that really enabled us to our successful transformation. And then now Charlene, she's going to go ahead and talk about, what was the environment and how did that transformation take place from her perspective as an Agile coach.
All right, thank you, Henry. So as Henry pointed out, there were a couple of attempted transformation points in time when Vantiv tried to do this. So early in 2015, as he mentioned, there was another transformation attempt with significant buy-in from senior leadership and also an understanding that this would have to be across the organization to make it work this third time. So I came on board along with another coach, Scott Green, to start working with some of the trains and understand, keeping in mind what the past challenges were. So as you can see here, we had that buy-in and sponsorship, but we were also operating under kind of an organized transformation roadmap. So there were actually a predetermined set of teams and trains to be launched, and we wanted to start using that particular roadmap to get started with what we thought was the right approach. You could see also that we had a team of coaches, and over time, we would add more to that so that we could continue on to launching some more teams and trains based on that schedule. Some tweaks were made based on what we were learning as we were forming teams and trains, and then to accelerate the pace, then we ended up bringing on more coaches as well. We eventually had 6 external Agile coaches from Icon Technology Consulting, and we also had a transformation coach from Rally as well helping us. So what we ended up doing to launch some of these teams was to use some customized training. A lot of these teams had never used any type of Agile process before. So they basically, we basically had to start from ground zero with getting started with basic Agile processes first, and then getting the teams to understand how to operate within a safe model after they've been using some Agile team processes for a little while. Then we would follow that up with some additional training for specific roles, such as Scrum Masters and Product Owners. And then eventually, after the team had been using Scrum for a while, we would actually take them through SAFe training so that we could understand how to operate as a team of teams. And there was actually a lot of momentum that came with the first train that we launched, but the leading SAFe class actually helped all of the teams understand how we wanted to operate together when we had a lot of teams that were part of a train that we were scheduled to eventually deliver value on. One of the key drivers with our transformation this third attempt as well was having a guiding coalition. So we did have an Agile transformation team that was helping, that the coaches were a part of as well, where we had leaders and different representatives from all different parts of the organization. And by having those different parts of the organization, we were able to come up with and problem solve for specific areas that would help make this transformation successful. So you can see here, these are leadership from the product organization, also from IT. Architecture was important to have in this group as well, and also the strategy for the company. The coaches took a very heavy part in this transformation team as well. So there were many possible approaches that we could have taken, but it was decided very early on when this transformation roadmap was first created to go ahead and look at maybe one of the most challenging areas of the company. So with Vantiv, as Henry mentioned earlier, they have grown through acquisition. So we've got a lot of legacy applications and long-standing applications and platforms. So the decision was made to actually start with one of the more traditional teams that have been using, working as mainframe programmers for a long time. They've been with the company for like 20 or 30 years, and these were like COBOL programmers. So we actually took them through that customized training and formation that I mentioned earlier, where we would make sure that they understood Agile processes first, starting them into the tool to actually learn how to write user stories and features and things like that, just to get the basics right. And we eventually took them through a leading safe class. So that would actually be all the teams on the train, their leaders, the product organization, architecture associated with that specific group. And once we actually did the leading safe class, and more specifically the PI planning simulation, a lot of people that were part of that class saw an immense amount of value with trying to see if we could organize as soon as possible to do our first train launch or do our first PI planning event. So roughly 3 to 4 weeks after that leading safe class, we ended up launching our first train, and that was hailed as a success because from a lot of the different organizations that were part of that, they had never seen that level of alignment. So that was hailed as a success, and it actually got a lot of visibility throughout the rest of the organization, where we had a transformation roadmap mapped out, but then instead of the transformation team maybe going out to the different organizations that were part of that roadmap and working with those organizations to launch them, it became more of a pull where a lot of those groups were coming to the coaching group and the transformation team wondering when they were going to be next. So it created a lot of momentum. And one of the other things to call out about this first train too, with it being our success and our first official train launch, was the fact that they ended up winning this Envisioneer Award. So the Envisioneer Award is basically, recognition for innovative work that brings significant change to the enterprise. So they actually won this at the end of 2015 as a result of that good work, and they're still operating successfully as a train today. One of the key call-outs, too, that I want to make sure that I don't underestimate or underemphasize is the fact that these custom launches, required everybody that was going to be part of the train to actually be a part of the training so that we can understand where they are today, how they operate, what their workflows are. And then at some points, in some instances, we realized that some trains and some of the teams on them maybe were not necessarily teams by themselves, or maybe there were one big team that needed to be split into multiple teams. And in the case of this core processing train, we realized that some of these teams could actually be collapsed into a smaller group of teams. So that's another part of the formation too that's very important is, are you structured the right way today? Is there some tweaking that we need to do that would help you deliver value in a different way, more efficiently? So you can see here, it was all hands. Everybody had to travel to the site, be part of the training face-to-face. We would start kind of from the top down as far as, what does your group do? So we would work through lean canvas sessions, understand the roles that would be fulfilled by the different team members, and then actually went through formation, understanding how a team should operate, understanding responsibilities with the various parts of an Agile team, such as what does the development team do, what does the product owner do, what does the Scrum Master do, and then, of course, the tools training was part of that as well. So once again, that first train launch was very successful. Go ahead, Henry.
Yeah, I was going to say, let me just add a few points here as well, if you don't mind. On the different approaches, so in our previous attempts, we had taken teams that, some people would say was low-hanging fruit, or, that they weren't mainstream, and even though we were able to show some level of success there, there was always the people that were, contrary to popular opinion, were saying, well, that works great for them, that wouldn't work for us. So that's why we felt very strongly that our mainframe core processing group, the COBOL assembler developers, was really the one set of teams that we needed to be successful with, because we knew that if they were successful, then everyone else would pretty much have no reason why they wouldn't be able to be successful. And then, as far as the custom launches go, the one thing that coaches were able to bring together with this was, we started getting to the point where we had to bring on more coaches to meet the supply of the demand of teams and trains wanting to launch. Well, the coaches were able to, continually hone the custom launch training materials, and the one thing that it did allow was, even though we got up to 6 coaches at one time, Vantiv, we felt comfortable that each of the teams and the trains were being taught and guided and mentored in the same fashion in a consistent manner. So many times you may get multiple coaches into an environment, and they may have different ways of doing things, but with this custom launch approach and the training materials, they were able to bring and provide a very consistent manner across all the teams and trains, and even so much where we would have coaches helping other coaches at times, and it was very easy for them to really step in to understand what was happening, because it was a lot of the same background foundational information that was provided. So that was hugely valuable for us to ramp up as fast as we did.
Absolutely. Thank you, Henry. So along the lines of consistency, we've got this artifact that's showing right now that basically articulates some of the points that Henry was making with, we've got an organized methodology to launch teams and then eventually launch the trains that those teams are a part of, and just basically making sure that we follow the same pattern across, so that everybody gets the same type of training and everybody gets the same, has the same set of expectations going into the formation event, and then coming out of the event to start preparing for their first train launch or PI planning event.
Yeah, and with that, as I said earlier, some of the initial things that we had done was, we bought tools, we agreed we wanted to use SAFe, and we jumped right in. Well, what we forgot to do was spend time with our individuals and our teams. And the plan that we rolled out here with Charlene and Scott and the other coaches was, we wanted to build a solid foundation, a strong foundation. So as you see on this slide, many of the things in that really revolved around it were focused on the individual or the individual Agile teams. We really didn't focus on anything from a scaled perspective until after we had a team that we considered was comfortable and fairly sustainable as an individual team. Whereas before, we jumped right into scaling some things that we didn't even have a strong foundation around. So that was another advantage of having this consistent approach to bringing up Agile teams.
Okay, and along the same lines here, is once you form teams and then eventually launch a train, is being able to have some level of measure around, how are we progressing? So there are these different levels that, once a team, they may be in what you don't see here is maybe a level 0 when they're initially forming, but after they form as a team and are using some of these Agile practices, and then over time you can see that they can actually increase their maturity to these different levels. And then at the same time, as teams are growing and eventually trains are launched, we want to still focus on the teams and understand if there are any blockers that maybe they're going to need help with to mature. And, we want to keep that at the forefront, and that's what we're showing here on gauging progress and also blockers, so that we understand what we need to do to help teams that are parts of these trains to improve on.
So one of the things that we had done during the formation of teams was, we set up every 2 weeks we would have a team, what we called team retrospective. And what we tried to do was bring just bring people in from the various teams to talk about what are the things that are going well with regards to your transformation to become Agile? What are the roadblocks that you're hitting? And we got to the point where we let the teams help drive the priorities of the Agile transformation team. So the coaches obviously were working with the teams on a day-to-day basis, but for those things that maybe were organizational in nature that it really needed to have some level of management to kind of help intervene to go ahead and remove roadblocks and stuff, we went ahead and let the teams really help dictate what should those priorities be. We got to the point where even teams that were getting ready to transform, having them come into the session so that they could start to hear some things that are going on, so that as teams were going through issues, it wasn't like, hey, I'm going through this alone. Teams have already done it. So we really helped to try to build a collaborative network during the transformation, just so that teams could not, so teams wouldn't feel alone, like, hey, am I the only one facing this issue and whatnot.
Right, and not only were the retrospectives an input to a lot of the blockers that you see listed here, but the coaches actually work with the trains and the teams on those trains to do team level assessments, usually pretty early on in their formation and transformation, to set a baseline, and then the expectation was to go back and continuously, maybe or periodically, measure and run another assessment to see if there were any improvements made. So it was very important to make sure that level of progress was at least started and to be measured, so that we can identify any of those issues that we need to keep at the forefront of the transformation. Okay, so continuing on with the current transformation, we mentioned before that we initially started with a small subset of coaches, but then as we're launching teams and launching trains, identifying the need to maybe accelerate the pace resulted in maybe modifying some of the roadmap, and then maybe bringing some more coaches on board. So where Vantiv is currently is that there are 15 Agile release trains running today across many of the delivery groups, and there's also some infrastructure groups involved in that as well, and over 105 Agile teams. The teams are mostly platform application or service-based, and then we have a consistent backlog structure to make the work that the groups are working on visible, and that's being made visible in our Agile tool. So with the majority of those delivery groups stood up as Agile release trains and delivering today, the focus started to turn more towards some of the other items, maybe some of the non-development or non-application group-focused parts of the organization, such as infrastructure and some parts of the technical operations group and things like that. But as part of also maturing the transformation, starting to stand up some communities of practice, a center of excellence, and providing continuous safe training. Because even though we may have stood up some teams and trains a couple of years earlier, sometimes people may come and go, but there's always the need for refresher training and also additional training to make sure that now that these folks have been operating in certain roles for a few PIs now, that there may be some need to enhance their skills, and now that they have context, the training can provide a lot more value. So that the training is one of those things that you want to continue as you start thinking about, how do I sustain an Agile transformation. And at this point, we mentioned that the Agile transformation team was formed very early on with a large collection of folks from different parts of the organization, such as product, IT, et cetera. But that was a fairly large team. So over time, that team actually morphed and is now the Agile Center of Excellence, and it's a much smaller and more focused team that is basically there to help continue the transformation and make sure that the oversight is being provided to make sure the value is continuously delivered on the trains. Okay, so where are we now? So that was the present transformation, but now let's talk about sustainment. How do we sustain the transformation now that we've got the majority of the groups operating in this fashion, and that's become the common operating model across Vantiv? So as we mentioned before, there needs to be some internal driving agent or internal driving team to help make sure that the value is being realized, that trains and teams on those trains may not start to revert back to old practices, and also that there's guidance and governance around some of the delivery of the various groups. So the Agile Center of Excellence is that main group that provides that central oversight. That group, along with our internal change agents and internal coach that is actually part of this, is collectively there to help make sure that those practices and standards are still ongoing. At the same time, you want to make sure that the enablers are in place so that the different trains that are part of this and the teams are, have the empowerment. So we decentralize control to them as long as they understand, what the priorities are for the things that need to be delivered, so that they can self-organize and can continue to deliver value on their teams.
So, with this model, this was, when we first started our transformation, this particular one in 2015, our executive team was very, very open to bringing in outside consultants to help. But as we got towards the end of 2015, like most executives, their question was, I'm seeing progress, but when are we going to be done? When's this transformation going to be over? Well, one of the things that I myself had to learn was Agile, if you're truly doing Agile, it's never over. In other words, you're not going to sit there and say, we're done with improving. You want to go ahead and continuously improve. That's essentially the definition of Agile. So the thing we had to do was really get ourselves in a position where we could sustain Agile here at Vantiv. Now, from an executive's perspective, they're like wanting to know, well, essentially, when are you going to be done spending my money? Well, unfortunately for them, it was going to take some time for us to really burn in Agile within the culture here at Vantiv. So what we did was we put together a plan where 2015 was really focused on ramping up the Agile teams. And as we went through 2015, as Charlene had talked about, the scope of the teams and the trains just grew tremendously as everyone wanted to be part of the Agile transformation. So we actually got to, I think, 6 or 7 Agile coaches before the end of 2015, and we carried that over into 2000. Now, throughout 2016, we went ahead and took actions to really start to move away from the external consulting model and get to this sustainable model as Charlene's been talking about.
Absolutely, and that's a very good point. You want to make sure that you understand that transformation is a long-term journey, and it's not just some kind of overnight goal that you try to hit and then move on from. So that's why enabling the sustainment requires dedicated Agile Center of Excellence and internal champions. Okay. So once again, sustaining the Vantiv transformation, encompasses really focusing on more of those organizational challenges. In the time that the coaches were working diligently to form teams and launch trains and surface these blockers, they were basically put on a backlog that everyone knew, the ACE knew that these would have to be addressed. So once we had the majority of these trains formed and launched and delivering and operating, then it was time to start to focus on some of these other areas of Agile improvement. And you see some of those areas there, like DevOps and maybe value stream alignment and additional training, additional safe training for leaders and other groups. But also understanding too that the decisions that you make as far as how trains are formed and how we choose to launch trains based on the teams and the alignment that they have within their own organizations, can lend itself to high dependencies depending on how you structure that. So some of the things that the coaches realized over time was the fact that that high dependency can sometimes cause our flow to be inhibited. So something that the coaches were championing was trying to get a multi-train PI planning event to basically have all of these tightly coupled trains work together to plan, to not only show the amount of dependencies that exist between the trains, but also show how they can work, how working together and planning together can help enable better planning. So the first instance of that multi-train PI planning event actually happened this past December, where we had about 9 of our Agile release trains and about 4 additional teams that are operating in this kind of safe model take part in an event and we actually created a portfolio board that showed dependencies between the trains, and it provided so much information and visibility to not only the trains that were doing the work, but also to the lines of business, senior leadership, product, and everyone else that maybe just did not realize exactly how much dependencies, we were talking about. So the visual impact of that board was very significant, and I believe it's still hanging up on one of the walls within Vantiv to serve as an indicator of how much dependencies there are. But there should be another PI event, I believe, happening at the end of this month.
That is correct. Yes.
Right. So it provided a lot of value and communication, and was actually a very successful event as well. So the other key parts here about sustainment would be metrics and governance. So the Agile Center of Excellence provides oversight, like we showed on the slide before, as far as how the trains are doing. But we need a set of key metrics to understand, are we leveling off? Are we increasing? Are we having any issues in particular areas? So those metrics are important for us to improve our performance and predictability. And we'll look at an example of a metric on the next slide. Governance is also key, right? Because we want to make sure that that the trains have sufficient oversight so they understand what they're trying to deliver and what these metrics actually help, how they actually help them deliver. Over time, obviously, when you're part of a transformation, you do need the help of external coaches, because as we mentioned earlier in this webinar, having internal-only coaches may create conflict since they report internally and they may have maybe a skewed view of maybe how things should run. But external coaches provide this external view from working with various other organizations where they can provide feedback that's a bit more neutral to help the teams and help those trains deliver. But the coaches aren't there to be on site forever, so there's a fine line with how much external coaching support you need before the organization is ready to kind of start to manage itself. So eventually the coaches, including myself, ramped off, and before we did that, we helped to ramp up processes with the ACE, with the Agile Center of Excellence, and also with the internal coach that would be transitioning, and also with internal champions from the different delivery groups, the different Agile release trains, product, infrastructure, and some of those other groups so that they can start to help themselves. So that's definitely one of the parts of sustaining a transformation as well, is making sure that there's sufficient effort, time, and energy spent with bringing these internal champions and these change agents up to speed within the organization.
And to that point, we invested heavily last year into getting training across the organization. So currently we have probably, I think, around 27 people here at Vantiv that have gone through and passed their SPC certification, the implementing safe training. And this year we plan on doing some more training. Some of the newer classes that are coming out are like the safe RTE class. I believe actually ICON's offering that across various locations over the summer. Those are the types of classes that we invest in with our individuals, and we usually do that like with the RTEs or some of the leaders of the trains, with the expectation that they would then be able to help facilitate change across their teams within their train, and really more of a train-the-trainer model where they would then be able to help those individuals learn more about the material that's covered in these external classes.
Thank you, Henry. As I mentioned earlier with metrics are what can help provide leading or even lagging indicators as far as how the trains and the teams on the trains are doing. This is an example of a metric that Vantiv has come up with, as far as being able to look at how these teams are doing. So I'll let Henry talk about this just a little bit, but it's basically the Agile maturity curve, and it's basically used to measure the progress and maturity of these teams based on the levels that had been mentioned earlier.
Yes, so as we talked about earlier when we were showing the different levels and then the blockers, what we had done was, as soon as we started down the transformation path this time and teams got excited, started moving forward, we were asked, how's things going? How's things progressing? Well, from this transformation perspective, it wasn't a matter of reporting upon milestones, because just because teams maybe went through the formation or they did a PI, that didn't necessarily mean that they're maturing the way we would like to see from an Agile perspective. So we established 4 levels of maturity for an Agile team. Level 1 was, you're an Agile team, basic Agile team with a backlog. For the most part, you've gone through the formation and you've sprinted. You've had a couple sprints. Level 2 was now you're operating, within the tool set of choice, which in our case was Agile Central, as well as you're operating as a train, and you've gone through a PI planning event and an entire PI. Levels 3 and 4, when we first started in 2015, were somewhat vague. In true Agile fashion, we figured we'll flesh those out as we get teams that get to that point, because we didn't know what we didn't know. Well, as things have played out through 2016 into this year, really a lot of what level 3 and 4 is focused around is around capabilities around quality, integration, and deployments. So from a DevOps capability, if you would say, we've really embedded those capabilities in levels 3 and 4. So that's really how we've been able to continue down the path with the Agile transformation for the teams, is we continue to push them to continuously improve in the various areas that make up our maturity levels. Now, in addition to saying, how are we maturing as an organization, we got to the point where it was time to say, well, how are we performing? So what we've done is we're leveraging metrics out of Agile Central around predictability, productivity, responsiveness, and quality. And really what we're doing is we're just looking at how these teams are performing, not as a scorecard per se, but more as, what teams need help, what teams maybe need some areas that we go ahead and need to improve upon. So, that's where we're talking about measuring the success. It's the progress of maturity and the performance of the team. So that's the extent of, how we're measuring today.
Okay, and that's an example of metrics that you could use, but obviously you would want to contextualize that to your own organizational environment. So we've covered a pretty good spectrum of the journey. With Vantiv, it's been 3 attempts, with the 3rd one going to the present day and now in the sustainment mode. So let's take some time to recap some of the success criteria. So if you're actively going through a transformation and you want to make sure that certain areas are covered to make sure that you can actually actively sustain a transformation after your external coaches have moved on, these are some of those areas that you want to consider, right? Obviously, what made the Vantiv transformation successful was really getting that executive buy-in. And I want to just say, not just buy-in, but also active engagement and participation, because sometimes, buy-in is not necessarily enough. Forming an Agile Center of Excellence, and the operative terminology used here is on purpose, right? Because if you have an Agile transformation team, the name implies that it's just kind of, you're trying to get to a certain state and you're going to move on. But an Agile Center of Excellence implies this continuous improvement, that there's always going to be oversight, and that we're going to continue to improve things indefinitely, right? And then centralized prioritization and alignment was one of the other themes for the organization, as far as we want a centralized global view of the work that the enterprise needs to do, and having a view of that prevents a lot of the siloed work that was happening before. It doesn't necessarily prevent it 100%, but it does help. It does help to provide the alignment that you need, so that it becomes a lot more visible when you go to these big PI events, when there are these other groups that need to be part of this process that may not be part of it just yet. Ongoing safe training is another key thing that you cannot get away from, because, like I mentioned before, you've got several groups within a train that are there to help deliver, but inevitably people come and go. So you want to make sure that you provide any new folks that come on board the process a way to understand how we're operating, and safe training provides that, but also in the spirit of continuous improvement and relentless improvement, safe and scaled Agile provide a continuum of classes to improve and enhance the skills of the people that are delivering on these trains today. And you heard Henry mention a couple of them, right? So Scrum Master training, release train engineer just came out this year to help that specific key role on our trains improve and enhance their skills, and that's only going to help your train. Also, continuous Agile coaching. Just because the team of Agile coaches that help with this transformation and help form these teams and launch these trains are no longer there does not mean that teams and trains no longer need dedicated coaching. In fact, they probably will need more. So the coaches that we have internally as part of the train, maybe a release train engineer is technically a coach for the train, but we also have a dedicated Agile coach for the enterprise that's helping across the trains as well. Continuous Agile coaching is needed. It doesn't go away. And enabling internal champions is an important part as well. All of the groups that have used SAFe within Vantiv are operating in this operating model, but they need to have active engagement with each other, and they need to also champion the process within their trains to make sure that they're enabled and empowered to deliver successfully. And finally, this last two things here are this kind of inspect and adapt, right? Just having that continuous improvement or relentless improvement mindset where, we're at a point today. I've yet to see a train that's in a perfect state. So this is one of those areas where you want to make sure that, the Agile Center of Excellence, the internal change agents, the coaches are always trying to improve and enhance the ability of the different groups that are using SAFe. The metrics are one of those tools that can help you provide, help provide guidance and help provide indicators as far as how those teams and trains are doing. So come up with a set of metrics that are important to your organization and use those wisely, right? Because, metrics sometimes have the ability to be misread, but find the right metrics to show the value delivery that your trains are accomplishing. And if, on a similar note, they need to also indicate whenever trains may be having trouble delivering. So all of those things together really helped Vantiv achieve a sustainable transformation. That doesn't mean it's ending today. There's lots of other areas that are on the transformation backlog that need active attention, and there are things that cannot be fixed, within the span of a few months. They may take a longer time to achieve, but this is a good starting point, and this is a good example of how you can build up something sustainable if you keep these things in mind. Henry, did you have anything to add?
The only thing I would add is, while we talk about a lot of SAFe training, I would totally agree that a lot of that training is needed across the enterprise. One of the ways that we went about doing that was by getting individuals trained to be SPCs. So for some of the classes like the Advanced Scrum Master class and things like that, we were able to leverage individuals within our company, namely like our Agile coach, internal Agile coach, who's SPC certified, that has an understanding and a knowledge of that material to provide the training internally as a very reasonably priced alternative to sending somebody across the country or wherever the local city is. So as you're thinking about going down this path, absolutely you want to get trained by the experts, the people that know it, but as you start to build that expertise internally and when you start to move towards a more sustainable environment, there are definitely areas where you can go ahead and leverage individuals internally to provide a lot of this knowledge for you.
That's a great point. Thanks, Henry. So that is our summary. I think we'd like to go ahead and open this up for questions, but I'm going to go ahead and turn this back over to Stella. Do you have any?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do, Charlene. We got some good questions. And I think this is a good one for you, Charlene. What challenges did you find with training teams to understand and implement Agile practices as well as SAFe practices at the same time, or practices and principles at the same time?
Challenges, obviously, I would think that one of the biggest challenges is that kind of traditional mindset. When we talked about one of the first trains or groups of teams that we started to form and launch into this Agile process, even before we started using SAFe, this is just basic Agile, is just trying to understand the basic benefits, understand what Agile is meant to do, and being able to explain to them, how to manage work in these smaller chunks. Because people that have a strong traditional mindset, and I'll go back to the first train that we worked on, which was the core processing train, have been thinking in such a way for a long time, and a lot of them work work by themselves essentially, where they already know what they need to do. They've just never been forced to document it in any particular pattern. So it's really working with individuals to help overcome how they're used to thinking and being able to break out what they do in a more functional perspective to where we could see value delivery incrementally. So that's why it was important for groups that had never even operated in an Agile fashion to at least have some basic understanding of Agile, and then also go through some specific team training and run a few iterations first before moving to something like SAFe, right? So I think it's a combination of. Go ahead.
But even to that point, we had several teams that were that they would be considered Agile or hybrid Agile. So what we did at Vantiv was, whether the team had worked previously in Waterfall, Agile, hybrid Agile, or whatever they wanted to call their process, we required them to go through this process, because the one thing we wanted to do was ensure consistency across the enterprise and how everybody worked with regards to the Agile. And that's really one of the things that SAFe brings to the table, is consistency across the teams, as well as the ability to have that alignment and transparency across the teams.
Right, and good point. And a lot of the preparation activities, even following that pattern that we showed earlier with consistency with the checklist and everything across the different teams on trains, the amount of effort in that area is kind of directly related to any Agile experience that they've had before. So if it's a group that's never been Agile, it might take a little bit longer before you get to that first SAFe launch, but overall it's really just working very closely with the teams and the team members.
Okay, very good, thank you. And here's another question, this one probably for Henry, is how do your trains align with your products or business strategy goals?
So we went ahead and made a decision early on that we were going to go ahead and align our trains based on our subsystems or our components, and not necessarily by capabilities. And that's one of the things that we're looking at trying to do here going into this year. When we took a look across our enterprise, we realized that from our components are, we have a huge set of components across the whole ecosystem, as far as whether it's mainframe, both COBOL, assembler, Java, .NET, Salesforce components. So we are still struggling with trying to get a consistent view of being able to do development within an environment by multiple teams. So our focus initially was to start off in component base, which was probably the most familiar to how we were organized before. But our goal this year is to start to get to the point where we're more organized around our product lines and our business units versus just being component based.
Thank you, Henry. Next question, maybe also for you. The question is, have you implemented the portfolio level of SAFe? And if so, can you describe your funding process?
So we have implemented a portfolio level of SAFe. And so at this point in time, we are still funding projects per se. But what we have been able to do is we've been able, through the portfolio level, bridge the gap between funding of projects across the enterprise and allocation of those funds to our various trains. Now, as we've gone through this, and I'm sure Charlene and other coaches will attest, being organized component-based like we have been, or we are, really makes being able to align our portfolios difficult. Because for any large initiative that comes in the door, we normally hit 2 to 3, if not more, of our Agile release trains, just because of the spectrum of components that would be impacted. If we were in a more of a value stream or a component or a capability aligned set of trains, we would be able to have a more clean funding pattern where we could fund a set of trains that aligns to a product line or a line of business. But really right now what we've been able to do is within the portfolio level, we've kind of separated the two where we could show here's the demand at a portfolio level, essentially from initiatives to epics, and how that is portrayed based on our lines of business. And then when you flip over to feature, from feature to user story, that's how it's really represented across our trains with with the various different trains. Now, naturally, what that means is we've got a lot of large initiatives that hit multiple trains, so there's a lot of coordinating across trains that has to take place.
And that's actually one of the reasons that we discussed earlier about the multi-train PI planning events that are occurring today. Vantiv uses a quarterly PI planning cadence, or closely aligned to quarters PI planning cadence, and a lot of the movement towards trying to be more capability aligned is actually made very visible when we do these multi-train PI planning events. As I mentioned before, we use a portfolio board. Normally in PI planning, each of the trains will have their own program board to show dependencies with the teams within the train, and maybe some dependencies outside the train. But there was definitely a need, with all of the close, tight coupling between the trains that we have today, that we wanted to give that visibility cross-train, and that's what our portfolio board does. So providing that in the event, the trains that are part of the multi-train PI planning event are still doing their own local program boards for their train, but then they also bring up kind of a higher level view of cross-train dependencies, and that helps paint the picture of the need to try to find maybe some alternatives to how we're delivering today. And that portfolio board definitely helps.
Thank you. Another question, this is a quick answer, I believe. How many internal Vantiv coaches are supporting your programs today, Henry?
We've got one internal coach, but we spent lots of time with the release train engineers across each of the trains. So I'd be amiss if I didn't say we had 15 Agile coaches, one for each of the trains, as well as one internal coach that's focused across all of the trains.
Okay, thank you. Do your teams work independently before they join a train? Are your teams formed before they join a train?
Yes, yes, that was the model that we had worked under, is that we would have the Agile coaches forming the teams, and we'd have them sprint for a couple of sprints, depending on however many it seemed that to get them comfortable with Agile. Then, like Charlene had mentioned, we'd introduce them to leading safe, and then probably a couple weeks later we would bring them together as a train and do their first PI. So yes, they would start off as working as individual Agile teams initially.
Okay, great. Do you have teams that choose Kanban over Scrum? Or do you have teams that are Kanban teams instead of Scrum teams or SAFe teams? Or part of the SAFe program? Okay.
Yes, we do have some teams that are Kanban that are part of Agile release trains.
Okay. How large is Vantiv's IT organization, and are you distributed geographically?
Yes, we are distributed. We've got offices in Phoenix, Denver, Durango, Colorado. We've got them here at headquarters in Cincinnati, Boston, down in Texas. So, and then we also have a component of offshore with some of our teams. So we are, distributed. And I would say from an IT perspective, we're around 1,000 individuals across IT. So.
Okay, good. A couple more, maybe a little more technical questions, but how do you handle production support? Do you allocate capacity or inject problems into backlogs and let them work themselves out, sort themselves out?
Sure, I can go ahead and answer that. So, when we formed teams and trains, we made a decision early on that, there's a couple different ways to handle production support for the same team that does development and production. And one of them is just to reduce capacity for available new development work. And the second option would be to make that all of the work explicit. So we chose option number 2. So in that sense, we do have capacity allocated in each sprint to handle any type of production support work. And we manage that across sprints to see, if the right amount of points were allocated, so that we can track that over time.
Thank you, Charlene. Henry, here's the question for you. Metrics can be challenging. How can you discuss some of the challenges and opportunities that you encountered when working with executives to define and agree on these? And how are you measuring value to the customer?
So that's an excellent question, and that's one we're still trying to solve, quite honestly. In order to, the one area where we are weak at this point is being able to quantify value. And that's really one of the key initiatives for the first half of this year, is being able to capture and report upon the value that's provided across the various features. There's tools out there like WizGIF and things like that where you can determine what a value of a particular feature might be, but at the end of the day, what our executives want to know is, if the value was, X number of dollars broken out this way, and what did we get for that, and how many of those dollars did we get back? So from a value perspective, that is an initiative for this year. Now, with regards to the other metrics, the maturity of the teams, that took a little while for us to help mold and get them comfortable with understanding, but really, for the most part, it was more or less, we started those, both that and the performance stuff, as metrics to help the teams and the trains. It wasn't necessarily to provide the executives with everything they needed to know, but it did take us some time to really go through that with them to help them understand how we're using that and how that can be influencing their understanding of progress.
Right, and just to piggyback on that, as part of maturing the trains as well, is using business value to help understand predictability on the train. So we do get on many of the trains, we do get the involvement of our business owners to assign business value to our objectives that we come up with in the PIs, and they're actively involved in the PI demos at the end as well to see what value was realized. So that's another measure that can kind of show, are we producing the value that the business is expecting of us from a train perspective?
All right, I'm going to ask one last question here, and then we'll close the presentation. Henry, how have you seen employee behaviors and engagement change? And along those same lines, like how did you get your teams to respect the transformation and the process that you were trying to follow, so that they didn't go off the deep end before you were able to get them all engaged in following the process and following the steps that you were taking to success?
So let's be honest, people were already off the deep end before we really started this particular initiative in 2015. Our morale at that point was extremely low. We had just gone through an employee survey, and quite honestly, that's what precipitated the company to say, hey, we need to change our operating model because it was that bad. Well, our behavior, started slowly, but as we progressed, we started to see people having fun at work again. We started seeing people collaborating and talking. We've even got to the point where now Vantiv is rated as one of the top workplaces in the city and in the area. So definitely have seen growth in the employee morale. At this point in time, we were losing good talent to other companies. Now we're the one that's accumulating the talent from other companies, as people are now coming to Vantiv to work as opposed to going the other way. I mean, I can't share like specific numbers and stuff like that, but that's really the best way to quantify it, is that talent is now coming to Vantiv, whereas before we were losing our talent.
That's awesome. We were happy to be a part of that. And this is the conclusion of our presentation. Henry, thank you so much, and Charlene, for your time and the great Vantiv story. We really appreciate that. We will send a recording link to all of the attendees, so look forward to getting that. And if you want our help in helping you have a successful transformation, our contact information is on the back page of the link, on the back page of the presentation.